Members of state and federal parliaments would have recently received the Sydney Statement on Anti-Palestinianism, a document put together by the Arab-Australian Federation in consultation with leading community figures and renowned Australians and advocates for Palestine from diverse backgrounds. It is a statement in response to the incessant violations by Israel, a colonial settler state, of the Palestinian people's human, political, economic and national rights under international law, including their right to self-determination and nationhood. This statement, combating anti-Palestinianism, quotes non-violent means in international law and is based on, quote, a just and lasting peace between the parties, end quote. Former Foreign Minister Gareth Evans said of this statement, and I quote, its 8 principles are all expressed within restraint, seem to be unarguable and are consistent with the ALP's support for Palestinian statehood, end quote. This statement is necessitated by decades of discrimination and dehumanization against the Palestinian people. Blatant prejudice is evident when Palestinians engaged in a peaceful pursuit of nationhood are depicted as terrorists, stigmatized on religious or ethnic grounds, or characterized as an inferior people. Anti-Palestinianism prejudice can also target media, institutions, students and academics if they criticize Israel or sympathize with the Palestinian people. Anti-Palestinianism refers to a language and practice that directs discrimination, racism, hatred, or violence against the Palestinian people. This abuse can be verbal, explicit or implied, or reflected in violence. At its worst, it denies the existence of the Palestinian people, an erasure that facilitates the perpetuation of violence against them and the denial of their right to self-determination. Accusations of anti-Semitism should not be used to shield Israel from criticism of its oppression of Palestinian people and its defiance of international law. Often the strongest supporters of Palestinians are reflective and liberal Jewish people. Peter Bernhardt, the editor of the US Public on Jewish Currents, has written, and I quote, since pro-Israel organizations in the US have made it nearly impossible to discuss Israel-Palestine without addressing questions of anti-Jewish bigotry, Americans of all backgrounds have a responsibility to ask why even blatant expressions of anti-Palestinian bigotry passes almost unnoticed, end quote. Jewish Currents, July 6, 2021. To counter rising anti-Palestinianism, here are 8 principles. Principle 1, Palestinianism exists when Palestinian people are denied rights enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and all other relevant instruments of international law, including UN resolutions. Principle 2, the Palestinian people are entitled to their own state. A Palestinian state is consistent with international law, UN resolutions, and over 30 years of international negotiations. This is reflected in the recognition of the State of Palestine by 139 member nations at the UN. Anti-Palestinianism is flagrant when this right is undermined by settlement and acts of annexation, both illegal under international law. Principle 3, Palestinians who have committed to non-violent means to nationhood are entitled to all legitimate means of protest and advocacy. Palestinian leaders deserve respect and engagement, not isolation and boycott. Principle 4, as part of the international community, the Palestinian people have an inalienable right to membership of international organizations in line with these organizations' bylaws, including but not limited to the International Criminal Court, UNESCO, Interpol, International Court of Justice, and others. Principle 5, Palestinians have the right, in accordance with international law, to engage in resistance against unlawful policies and practices of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land. They are entitled to present to the world their case, supported by evidence and legal arguments that Israel authorities have dispossessed, confined, forcibly separated, evicted, and subjugated the Palestinian people. Principle 6, noting the UN's recognition of the State of Israel in 1949, was conditional on Israel's acceptance of the right of return, Resolution 194, Article 11. Palestinians are entitled to advocate their right of return as part of a just and lasting peace between the parties. Principle 7, Palestinians have the right to their history, including their right to commemorate Nakba, and this must never in any way be denied to them. Principle 8, international law brands collective punishment a war crime. When a Palestinian is arrested or convicted of an offence by Israeli authorities, there is no basis for Israel subjecting others to collective punishment.
Thank you. The Honourable Mark Pearce.